So thanks. Uh, in the last session, Hannah said that she wanted to understand, present, and discuss historical episodes and look for abstract concepts and philosophical frameworks that will lead to a better understanding of the episodes. She's describing a kind of integrated HPS that she takes from Hasok Chang's work. I think I want to do the same sort of thing, except with sociology and not history. So to look at present episodes of science and look for concepts and frameworks that are going to help us understand those episodes. Um, I'm doing a kind of ethnography of scientific imagination. So starting in 2015, I was looking at two collaborating systems biology labs. In 2018 and until the present, I've been looking at a mathematician and his students, a genetics lab, two climate science labs, a physics lab at CERN, and a space science lab that's connected with the European Space Association. I do unstructured and semi-structured interviews with always the lab head and all of the students, and sometimes with collaborating scientists. I do observations of the lab meetings, reading groups, the talks they give, and so on. And I perform a kind of grounded theory style coding and analysis to tell me something philosophically interesting. Here's a couple quotes, because otherwise you won't believe me that I've actually done anything. We have one PI saying, I cannot think of a scientific field where you could work without imagination. Another says, imagination is hugely important. There's this absolute requirement to be imaginative. And another PI says, imagination is extremely important to me. Through imagination, you don't just develop new techniques, you also frequently more directly look at whatever it is you're looking at. One last set of quotations from the PI at CERN. The only moment in which you do not have to imagine is when you have to assemble something with instructions, and even then. Anytime you have to make some kind of measurement, you should have a lot of imagination, since imagination creates the environment for the measurement. Also, when you have your data and you have to understand your data or extract from your data something that has not been seen before, you're going to need imagination. So I think I don't have the time to prove this with more quotations, but I have the quotations, and there's also independent work done by myself and a bunch of other philosophers of imagination to suggest, at least strongly suggest, that imagination can contribute to increased knowledge or increased understanding or accurate belief. In other words, it has some kind of epistemic import, specifically when involved in things like hypothesis generation, experimental design, data interpretation, problem solving, thought experiments, and so on. You can try to confine it if you want to the context of discovery, but then you have to defend the context of discovery versus justification, distinction, and so on. Specifically, the kind of imaginative act that I'm interested in is exploring a problem space using mental representations, where at least some of those mental representations are different in some respect that the scientist appreciates from what they believe to be true about the target system. There's lots of ways to define imagination. There are many broader ways to do it too. That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in. Now, one thing pops out immediately when you start to perform interviews and so on scientists is that they use tools to expand or to focus the power of their own imagination. So that should be pretty clear, at least since the 1600s. Bacon writes, neither the naked hand nor the understanding left to itself can effect much. It is by instruments and helps that the work is done, which are as much wanted for the understanding as for the hand. And as the instruments of the hand either give motion or guide it, so the instruments of the mind supply either suggestions for the understanding or cautions. I think we can update Bacon's idea that we need tools for the understanding and for the hand. We also need tools for the senses, and we need all kinds of different sorts of tools. I think we do have tools for the imagination as well. I think thought experiments are one of these pretty clearly. On the Stanford Online Encyclopedia, Brown and Fay go, right, thought experiments are basically devices of the imagination. We can say the same thing for diagrams. These provide public expressions of imaginative reasoning. Imaginative reasoning is often performed interactively with diagrams. Metaphors, too, I think, are tools that focus or expand the imagination. They're invitations to imagine, according to Walton. They engage the imagination. I think modeling has also been portrayed as an act of imagination or a series of acts of imagination. It can be understood as an employment of the imagination, according to Arnon Levy and Peter Godfrey Smith. I think you could say the same thing for analogies, computer simulations, and so on and so on. I think this is a novel suggestion to try to group all of these together and ask is there anything we can say at a general level about how all of these things can improve our uses of imagination in science? So how do we do it? Well, first of all, let's assume that they work. Let's assume that these sorts of tools do actually improve uses of the imagination, whatever we mean by improve. We'll get to that in a second. The question is, how do we account for that? Well, it depends on how we do epistemology of acts of the imagination. You have to have some way of saying, epistemologically speaking, when an act of imagination is better or worse, so that you can say this tool makes it better or worse. There's at least three options for doing this that I'm co-opting from mainstream epistemology. A good tool might improve the outcome of an imaginative act. In other words, we think that the outcomes are really what matters. Or we might say that a good tool brings an imaginative act in line with principles of good reasoning, and that's a kind of Deontic epistemology. Or we might think that a good tool is one that increases or enables an agent's epistemic virtues. So this would be to take a virtue epistemological framework. So in a bit more detail, here are our options. According to epistemological consequentialism, we should focus on states of affairs. These are the things that are epistemically good or bad. In other words, a state of affairs where I have more true beliefs is better than a state of affairs where I have one less true belief. And then you define actions as right or wrong insofar as they bring about good states of affairs. Deontic epistemology focuses on acts. So the acts are the things that are epistemically right or wrong. A right act is one that respects certain epistemic duties and norms. And then, according to virtue epistemology, we should focus on agents. Agents are the things that we should be paying attention to. They are the things that we should treat first and foremost. They're epistemically virtuous or vicious. Right actions are those that manifest the virtues of the agent. Let's get into a bit more detail. So, according to consequentialism of any kind, but in this case, epistemological consequentialism, the right is whatever instrumentally promotes the good. The good in this case is usually accurate belief or true belief, according to most of the people who are writing on this right now. Some people will take it to be knowledge. Now you've got two brands of this, just like you do with consequentialism and ethics. So you have direct epistemological consequentialism, according to which individual actions are the things that are going to be judged. We judge those actions based on how well or poorly they promote the epistemic good. Then you have the kind of indirect epistemological consequentialism, where we're now evaluating the rules. Even though really it's the acts that matter, we can evaluate the rules based on how well the rules, following the rules, promotes the epistemic good. In both cases, it's the outcome that matters here. According to Deontic epistemology, a right epistemic act respects certain epistemic duties and norms. There's a bunch of possibilities here that we might take as duties or norms. For example, you should form a belief that P if and only if you have sufficient evidence that P. Or form a belief that P if and only if that belief was produced in a reliable way. Or ensure the accuracy of all of your doxastic attitudes, where ensure doesn't mean bring about, but it means something like certify. Just to be very clear, on epistemological consequentialism, indirect epistemological consequentialism, you're following a rule because of its good consequences, whereas on deontic epistemology, you follow the rule because acting in conformity with that rule just is the fundamental epistemic good. Finally, we have virtue epistemology, which we're all familiar with. You want to explain an action's epistemic value in terms of the agent's epistemic virtues or vices. We've got a list here of some virtues: conscientiousness, humility, and so on. One example of this might be Ernest Sosa's account. So on this account, an act of imagination would be a good one if it achieves its aim because it manifests a competence, which is a disposition that would in appropriately normal conditions ensure or make highly likely the success of any relevant performance issued by it. Sosa's is a really well-developed account. There probably are simpler accounts where you just focus on the virtue of having a good imagination and try to develop exactly what that means. So which is best? Is it that good imaginative acts are those with good consequences? Is it that good acts are those that respect certain rules of imaginative reasoning? Or is it that good acts are just those that manifest the competences of virtuous imaginers? Well, looking at the data that I've gathered, in general, I think scientists talk about imagine in a way that suggests epistemological consequentialism. This isn't to say that they're right to do that, or that epistemological consequentialism is the correct framework in general, but I just want to say descriptively, this is how scientists seem to talk about imagination. For them, a good use of imagination is one that leads to something useful, no matter how absurd it seemed at the time, how long it took, or where it came from. One quote to support this, again, the PI from CERN says, at the end, they have to solve a problem. He's talking about lab members. How they solve a problem, I don't care. This is, I think, a really clear exemplar of means-end reasoning. here's a maybe more interesting case, or at least a case. So the Rosetta lander, Philae, it spent 10 years getting to this comet. It had special thrusters to keep it pushed against the comet while its landing harpoons could anchor it there, but neither the thruster nor the harpoons worked. Oops. Um, it bounced twice on the comet and came to a stop in a kind of shadowy region, meaning that instead of getting 60 hours of scientific experiments, the operators only got a few. So what are they going to do? Well, first they tried to drill into the surface to try to get a sample and then heat it up and then analyze the contents. But the drill failed because the lander was on a 30-degree angle. It couldn't make any purchase into the ice, to the soil. So the team didn't have much time. So one of them rapidly tried to imagine what else could they do with this lander where it was. And they knew that it had a mass spectrometer, but that needed a sample to analyze and they couldn't get one. So what if, they thought, they just opened up the mass spectrometer to space? They figured the lander probably kicked up some dust. And while you never, ever, ever want to open up a mass spectrometer, that would ruin everything. They thought, let's just try. Let's just open it up and see what happens. Maybe a sample will float in and they can analyze it. And it worked. This revealed a suite of 16 organic compounds comprising water vapor, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, along with smaller amounts of carbon-bearing organic compounds, including formaldehyde. Some of these compounds detected by these instruments play a key role in the prebiotic synthesis of amino acids. So this is actually pretty amazing because comets are like snapshots of the early solar system. And if those comets have all of these important compounds, which could be the building blocks for amino acids, that's really interesting. So this is a bit of scientific progress. It works so well, in fact, that now this method of opening up a mass spectrometer to the environment and getting a sample that way is called sniffing mode, and it's going to be used on several upcoming missions, both by NASA and ESA. So why was it a good thing that the scientists imagined opening up the mass spectrometer? Why was it a good thing that they came up with that idea? Well, they were trying to use what little time they had to discover something, anything, using their equipment. And they say that it was good to have imagined that, not because it's consistent with some rule that they were trying to follow, but because it worked. So I think retrospectively, when you ask scientists about a time when imagination really helped them out, you're going to get epistemological consequentialist type answers. I think this is an appropriate framework for describing the way that scientists talk. Now, there's the question of whether it's direct or indirect. I think it's direct. Because when you ask a scientist to walk you through a good imagining and they find a good imagining and you ask them why it was a good imagining, they always point to specific good consequences. They don't say it was a good imagining because it followed some set of rules where the rules usually have good consequences. And if you ask them whether there were any rules that they were following or whether there were any rules that you could follow because they have good consequences, the answer is always, I can't think of any, or there aren't any, or something like that. Now, if this is a good framework for describing the retrospective discourse of scientists about imagination, I also wonder about a kind of prospective account. How do they talk when you want to give advice for how better to imagine in the future? Well, you can't use direct epistemological consequentialism like we just were, because to have somebody say, I need help. I need to think of a way to imagine my way out of this problem I have. And if somebody said, you should just imagine the thing that has the best consequences, that's not very helpful advice because we don't know what's going to have the best consequences. You could have indirect epistemological consequentialism, perhaps. So you would propose a set of rules such that if we follow those rules, then the consequences will always or usually turn out best. I'm going to discuss that with Deontic epistemology because this is a similar sort of idea. You want to give a set of rules where following them is the good thing to do, whether because of the consequences or because that's what defines a good imaginative action. So according to Deontic epistemology, a right epistemic act is going to be one that respects certain duties or norms, perhaps appropriately constraining your deliberations, something like that. Well, there's two ways that epistemologists of imagination have already discussed to do this. One is to say that imaginings are good when they follow some logic of inference, such that truth or accuracy or something like that's preserved. And another option is to say that imaginings are good when they're constrained by the real world in their representations and manipulations of those representations. I don't think either of these are going to be completely satisfactory. They tend towards conservatism, and they would stymie our ability to use imagination to break the rules and to discover false dogma. If you told, if Einstein's trying to, come up with a solution to one of his problems, and you say you should just imagine whatever logic tells you to imagine, or you should have your imaginings constrained exactly by everything we currently know about physics, that would prevent him from inventing new physics. So I don't think a set of rules like that is going to be good. It could be good for other sorts of thought, but not for imaginative thought, which I think characteristically is supposed to break with some of our background knowledge, what that tells us. Also, and maybe just as importantly, scientists don't talk this way about imagination. You don't follow rules out of pure respect for the rules. That's not why you act certain ways that you act in science. You do it because you follow the rules when you do because they work, and you break the rules when you do because the rules aren't sacrosanct. And I think this tells against Deontic epistemology because any epistemology should be able to account for the practice of science. Now, what about virtue epistemology? Well, actually, scientists do speak quite often about imagination as if it were a virtue and that people can have better and worse traits of imagination. So they do talk in a way that is consistent with virtue epistemology as well. And I think this is actually going to be where we find our hope for a prospective account of imagination. So here's one quotation from a postdoc working in systems biology. So I asked, do you have any thoughts on how your own imagination works? And he said, well, I rely on luck a lot. Like I fade out and then boom. I haven't made a process out of it yet, and I should. I mean, I kind of have a process. I like sitting in cafes, looking at people. I like that movement and the hustle and bustle. Other times, if I'm writing code, I don't need people around. I probably just isolate myself, come into my cubicle, just me and my computer, and that's it. A little music maybe, and nobody else. Then there's this other phase where you want to present something, where you want to figure out something, and you really need to be around people. There's a few interesting things I think in this quotation and in the discussion that surrounded it. For example, the scientist wants to have a process for imagining, wants to have a set of rules, wants to have a method that would make his imagination work, but he doesn't have one. So what he does do is kind of try to encourage good imagining in any way that he can. And so a lot of the stuff you hear about how to be creative will be things like this, have a routine, collaborate, all this kind of general sort of stuff that I think sounds a lot like it's going to fit in with a virtue epistemology framework. You want to enable the virtue that you have, you want to develop that virtue in general, and so on. And so I asked all these different scientists about what you would do if you had a student who wasn't really very imaginative, and have tons of answers. So you want to provide good role models. You want to imagine out loud often in front of your students so they see kind of how it works, what you're doing. You want to give them lots of open-ended prompts to force them to imagine a bit on their own. You want to encourage a critical attitude, give them a bit of responsibility, not too much responsibility, but enough responsibility that's going to kind of make them really look hard at different possibilities. You want to give them the confidence to imagine, which is turns out actually a pretty important thing to do. You want to encourage all kinds of discussion. You want to avoid dogmatism. You want to reduce feelings of competition. Encourage people to admit that there are things that they don't know and talk about that. So to summarize so far, direct epistemological consequentialism captures scientific discourse about which previous acts of imagining are epistemically right or wrong in the eyes of the scientists. But it fails to provide any kind of prospective account for novel contexts. It doesn't tell you how to best imagine in the future. Deontic epistemology would offer guidance via a set of timeless rules that we should always follow using our imagination, but that I don't think works for imagination because part of the job of imagination is to break rules. Prospective epistemology of imagination seems best approached, I think, by virtue epistemology, which does, I think, capture scientific attitudes towards the pedagogy of imagination. So what can we say now going back to cognitive tools or tools that are meant to increase the power of our imagination? Well, retrospectively, looking back, when there exists a particular measurable aim, for example, making accurate predictions, increasing understanding, something like that, then an epistemically good tool is one that in the end increases that good, whether it be the accuracy of predictions, um, getting a sample from your mass spectrometer, increasing the understanding in a set of students, and so on. So if we're talking about increasing understanding, Maxwell's demon was a really good thing for Maxwell to have imagined, even though at the time his friends probably said that's not a thing that physicists should be doing. You shouldn't be thinking about demons, but we're glad that you did. Heisenberg's microscope makes sense for a physicist to be thinking about. He was trying to make, his matrix mechanical interpretation of quantum mechanics visualizable, but we know that it led people astray, that it wasn't actually a great thing for him to have imagined, for him to have gotten other people to imagine. Prospectively speaking, when we don't know the consequences of using certain tools in advance, the best advice is just to try to put yourself into a position that's going to facilitate good imagining. It's going to use tools that help you to imagine as best as possible, but we can't say in advance this tool is going to be better than that tool, um, because we can't say in advance what the consequences of using those tools are going to be. So um, Feynman diagrams, for example, or space-time diagrams. There's all kinds of diagrams we find in science textbooks that have lasted forever. And those are diagrams that are good because they help you imagine, they help develop your ability to imagine certain sorts of scenarios that are hard to do without those diagrams. But it's not necessarily to say that that diagram is going to be the one that's going to solve your problem. In conclusion, tools of the imagination can be good in at least these two different senses. Retrospectively, a tool is good when it focuses imagination or expands imagination in a way that has good epistemic consequences. Sort of like saying a baseball bat is good. You can say retrospectively when it allows the batter to hit the ball very hard and far and maybe accurately and causes the minimal amount of injuries. You can kind of say that in retrospect. It's hard to say prospectively always. Prospectively, what you want are tools. Prospectively, you can say that tools are good when they improve the imagination in general, when they increase our imaginative capabilities. This is something more like weighted bats or something that's going to help the batter become a better batter. So we have these two different senses of good. They're both equally important, I think, in science. And an interesting possibility that I think arises from this still very early work is that science may be actually a good test case for meta-epistemological frameworks. And that's all. Thanks very much.